good afternoon, everyone. My Keystone is titled Offshore Turbines, Green Bonds, and Public Opinion in Cape Cod. And I worked with Dr. Koskinen to create a white paper regarding offshore turbines in Massachusetts. So to start off with some brief background information, the coast of Massachusetts has been identified as having ideal conditions for the installation of an offshore wind farm, particularly around Cape Cod. Despite this, all prior proposals for offshore turbines have failed to come to fruition. Therefore, I set out to create a white paper in order to provide a recommendation to policymakers as to how to increase public support for an offshore wind farm. So the first part of this process was to conduct some research in order to provide an informed recommendation. So I ended up focusing on 5 main topics. The first was comparing offshore turbines to terrestrial turbines in order to learn about their advantages, such as being exposed to stronger and more consistent winds. The second area was the positive and negative ecological impacts turbines can have on marine life. The third area was the Cape Wind project, which was the most recent failed proposal. And I learned that the most commonly cited reason for it failing was the not in my backyard argument, in which locals essentially protested the project, citing that it would ruin their views and harm their property values. Fourthly, I focused on the effect that turbines can have on property values and read several studies with conflicting results. And lastly, I focused on green bonds, which are a relatively new form of financial security that are essentially conventional bonds issued to fund environmentally friendly projects such as wind farms. So after conducting this research, I was left with 3 key questions that pertain to the Cape Cod area. Firstly, what were the main concerns of local residents when it came to offshore turbines? Secondly, what is the level of local support and opposition? And lastly, would the use of green bonds to fund an offshore wind farm impact the level of support? So in order to find out, I conducted a survey of Cape Cod residents using Qualtrics. The survey consisted of 17 total questions and was targeted at determining locals' knowledge, support, and concerns regarding offshore turbines. Due to travel restrictions, I ended up distributing the survey digitally through posts on several Cape Cod-oriented forums and Facebook groups. These Facebook groups were primarily each devoted to news regarding different towns on the Cape. So the survey ended up receiving 89 unique responses, with the majority of participants being year-round residents of the Cape. One of the first things that I was curious about was whether an individual's awareness of the Cape Wind project affected their level of support for a future offshore wind farm. So as you can see in the graph, the majority of respondents were actually supportive of a new wind farm in the future, and most were aware or very aware of the Cape Wind project. However, you can see that only a small portion of the participants are opposed to a new wind farm. Therefore, the conclusions made about the opposition need to be taken with a grain of salt. So the next part of the survey focused on identifying the concerns locals had with the offshore turbines. So participants were asked to provide both their primary and secondary areas of concern. And as you can see, the majority of respondents are concerned with the ecological impact of turbines, with 67% citing it as their primary concern and 23% as their secondary concern. In contrast, only about 10% cited the aesthetic effect as their primary concern and 20% as a secondary concern. So this would seem to discredit the notion that the not in my backyard argument was the main obstacle to implementing an offshore wind farm previously. However, this picture changes when you control for the support level of the individual. So as you can see, ecology is undoubtedly the main concern of those who are supportive of a wind farm. Additionally, strongly supportive individuals are the most likely to cite the other category as an area of concern. And funnily, one of the most common replies in this category was that individuals were concerned that others would use the not in my backyard argument to oppose an offshore wind farm. But what is more interesting to me is that those who are opposed are much more likely to cite aesthetics as an area of concern, with 40% of those who are strongly against it citing aesthetics as their primary area of concern, compared to only 5% of strongly supportive individuals. So another thing that jumped out to me when looking at the raw data was the seen generational divide between age groups and support. And as you can see from the chart, it appears that individuals younger than 50 tend to be more supportive than those older than 50. Because of this, I decided to group all the age groups up to 50 together and look at the percentage breakdowns. As you can see, those under 50 were more supportive than any other age group. However, those over 70 were also highly supportive. But what I found very interesting was that the age groups of 50 to 60 and 60 to 70 had the highest percentages of individuals opposed to a wind farm. So to determine if this was statistically significant, I performed a chi-squared test, but the p-value was too high to be statistically significant at this moment. So finally, to answer my last question of whether or not funding a wind farm through green bonds would affect the support for it, I compared the support for a green bond wind farm to the support for a traditional offshore wind farm. So in the graph, the blue columns represent a green bond funded wind farm, while the green columns represent the same support levels from before. You can see that it appears that the inclusion of green bonds actually makes people more neutral and decreases support at first glance, seeming to indicate that implementing green bonds is not a viable option moving forward. However, this picture changes when we control for prior knowledge of green bonds. So of the 89 total participants, 35 indicated that they had knowledge of green bonds prior to taking the survey, while the other 54 had no prior knowledge. So in order to control for this, I compared the difference in support levels for both groups separately. As you can see in the tables, the previous shift towards being more neutral comes almost exclusively from individuals who had no prior knowledge of green bonds, which increased by over 300%. In contrast, overall support actually increased, while the number of those opposed and strongly opposed both decreased by 33% in the group with prior knowledge. Once again, I performed a chi-squared test to determine whether or not this relationship was significant, and we can say that prior knowledge of green bonds has a statistically significant effect on the support level for a green bond funded wind farm. So to summarize the key takeaways from the survey, the primary concern of Cape Cod residents when it comes to offshore wind farms is the ecological impact on marine life, but those opposed to a new wind farm were more likely to be concerned with the aesthetic impact. Thirdly, there appears to be a generational divide, with younger individuals being more supportive, although this is not proven to be statistically significant at this point. And finally, knowledge of green bonds increases the support for a green bond funded wind farm, which garners more support than a traditional wind farm among these individuals. Therefore, with these takeaways in mind, my recommendation to policymakers is that if they want to increase public support for an offshore wind farm, then they should focus on increasing public knowledge of green bonds, as well as the ecological effects of turbines. For instance, I recommend discussing several of the positive ecological effects that turbines can have, such as the reef effect, in which the bases of turbines provide a habitat for fish, which can increase their populations, or how decreased boat traffic can lead to fewer large marine animals being struck by propellers. This is mainly because it seems that the negative effects are widely known, while the positive ones are less so. Additionally, because of the possible generational divide, I recommend doing this through a series of local seminars and the distribution of pamphlets or a series of articles in one of the local papers in order to reach older individuals. This strategy would not only likely increase public support for an offshore wind farm, but also enable local residents to make more informed decisions when a new wind farm is proposed. Finally, in terms of the limitations of this project, the majority of them stem from the relatively small number of respondents. For instance, I had initially hoped to analyze the concerns of waterfront property owners in order to see if they were more likely to cite aesthetics as an area of concern, but I received too few replies from this group. Additionally, I was curious if seasonal residents who rented out their homes to tourists would be more concerned with either the aesthetic or the financial impact on property values, but once again, I received too few responses from this group. Therefore, it is possible that a larger sample size would allow us to navigate these questions and investigate these questions further in the future. Finally, one avenue for future study would be to group respondents by town in order to see if there are any other factors that affected support, such as proximity to the offshore wind farm's location. Thank you.